Community connections, CKMS. Local sounds, thoughts, passions, and success. Celebrate local, your neighbor's got a story to tell. Community connections, CKMS.
Happy Monday, Waterloo Region. You're listening to CKMS Community Connections. My name is Bob Jonkman. It is the 20th of April, 2026. Expecting some guests in the studio who have not quite arrived yet. Going to listen to a bit of music first. This is Jeremy Brendan Day.
How do I fit in when I don't know my place? Too many a moment spent with mind in space. Still I cannot change myself or rearrange what I have left. From this broken soul is a black hole that never ends. Tried to follow in the footsteps of greater men, but with every failure I slipped away from them. Still I couldn't tame myself. I held it in till I became repressed. Will these frail bones too soon be laid to rest?
That's Jeremy Brendan Day, who sadly passed away a few weeks ago. There is a memorial tribute for him at Maxwell's on June the 6th, along with a fundraiser.
On March 31st, 2026, Jeremy Brendan Day, a beloved Kitchener musician, friend, son, brother, and cat dad, passed away suddenly. Jeremy leaves a legacy of music, and his friends, family, and collaborators are uniting for a musical celebration of Jeremy's life, June the 6th from 12 p.m. to 5 p.m. at Maxwell's Concerts and Events. Performers will include Jeremy's band, The Resistance, Mary 5e, Kristen Latham, Todd Donald, Dottie Locks, Sandra Buza, John Stewart, Andrew Kennedy, and many more. Anyone wishing to help in the meantime is encouraged to donate to the GoFundMe at www.gofundme.com/f/Jeremy-Brendan-Day.
Stay tuned to CKMS FM. We'll have more information about Jeremy Brendan Day's memorial in upcoming weeks. I'm going to listen to a little bit of concert music, I think. This is called Skizzen für Siegbert für Solo Bratsche by Jesse Morrison. That is Schism for Siegburg for Solo Bratsche by Jesse Morrison. In the studio with me is Mike Morrice. Mike, welcome to CKMS Community Connections.
Thanks for having me back again. Good to see you, Bob.
Good to see you too. You're here for something completely different today. You're a consultant with Capacity Canada?
The title is Executive in Residence.
Okay.
It's a role that they have folks in for to provide support to nonprofits across Canada. In my case, my support is for nonprofits and charities in Waterloo Region.
Okay.
And so, I just felt like after the election, I wanted to continue to use my skills to support the organizations I was helping as an MP, and this has been a way to do it.
Okay. Tell me more about Capacity Canada. This is a new organization, something that's been around forever?
They've been around a lot longer than I have been on their team. I actually got support from them when I was starting Sustainable Waterloo Region back in 2008. And so I imagine they were around even just before that. They've been led by someone named Kathy Brothers since that time. And like I said, their support is to build the capacity of nonprofits across the country, particularly focused on leadership and governance. Okay. So they would, in my case with Sustainable Waterloo Region, they helped our board to sort out our process and policies and how best to govern a small startup organization. And they continue, actually, they do this boot camp in our community here in Waterloo Region once a year in November. And so nonprofits and charities across Waterloo Region would attend a 2-day session to get access to supports around how to best strengthen their boards. And they've also grown far outside that to provide various supports, a peer-to-peer for executive directors, a matchmaking program between organizations in our community looking to grow their boards and larger entities like Manulife and other larger firms. And so, a variety of supports around governance and leadership. And I'm just one of many of these executives in residence that are part of the team.
Okay, I've served on several boards, mostly here in Waterloo Region.
Yeah.
And governance is all over the place. Are there standard best practices that nonprofit boards should be adhering to?
Well, my focus has been more on fundraising, on government relations, and on kind of coaching of nonprofit leaders. I wouldn't purport to be the go-to governance expert in our community, but from what I've learned from Capacity Canada, from other colleagues, and from being a part of those boot camps, for example, there certainly are. Yeah, there's some best practices that boards can use. Of course, like at different stages for an organization, some organizations in our community that are just getting up off the ground, it's very much a working board where if you're on that board, you're helping make the organization function. And of course, for some larger entities that have a very strong governance mandate, they might be meeting just once a quarter with a strong staff team in place, simply to ensure the fiduciary responsibilities, so the financial well-being of the organization are being met, and to consider the kind of long-term plans for the organization. But yes, there are definitely some better ways to go about governing than others, and that's where Capacity Canada would step in to provide some of that support.
Yeah, there's a non-profit law, an Ontario law that deals with non-profit entities.
Yes.
So you'd figure that most non-profits that exist would be at least familiar with the law, if not actually following it.
Sure. Well, I can speak to my own experience. Almost 20 years ago now, I was looking to have an impact around addressing the climate crisis that we're in, and supporting organizations in our community to not just talk about doing better, but actually set targets and reduce their emissions as a result. I was coming out of university with a big idea, wrote a business plan, and, not an expert in starting a nonprofit or in governance, but on that trajectory, realized to do the thing I wanted to do, we would need a separate nonprofit to do it, to have the credibility of reporting back on the businesses that we were hoping to engage with. And so, speaking for myself, I had this ambition and this aspiration, and some sense of purpose around the impact we wanted to have, but had a lot to learn around what it would mean to have a board. And, did a quick online search and got some input and learned I had to complete some form to create a board. But there's a big difference between the legal requirement of having 3 named people on our letters patent,
Yes.
and the, I guess, the quality of organization I wanted to help create.
Right.
And I think that's where capacity comes in, is that there's a lot of nonprofits in our community doing amazing work. And I guess the hope is, through an organization like Capacity Canada, there's some kind of backbench support there to strengthen the governance of these organizations, to not only meet their legal obligations, but to help them have the biggest impact that they can have.
Yeah, to fulfill their mandate.
That's
to the
it,
community.
exactly. And that's actually a big part of why I feel this has been so fitting for me. Because I'm not sure how long we'll have till the next federal election. I will be running in the next federal election when that comes along.
Nice to hear.
Yeah, and happy to chat about that more. But I want to still be making a difference in the community in the time between.
Right.
And one of the tricks is we had a minority parliament up until recently, and may again, potentially, depending how certain Liberal MPs feel. Maybe we might have some floor crossers in another direction. And so the reality is, for someone like myself, it's not clear whether we might have an election in, up to the Prime Minister's prerogative in 2 months' time, 2 years' time, or up until 2029. And so for me, it's such a perfect role because I get to kind of be helpful.
Right.
I've learned a few things about how to raise money and how to engage with government. And now I get to be working with organizations, everything from those working around gender-based violence to reconciliation to climate to the arts. And in my case, it's a sliding scale up to pro bono as a result of a third-party funder. And so I get to be able to help these organizations raise the money they need and engage with governments to advocate for the policy changes they're looking for, to strengthen their missions. And that's been a lot of fun.
Okay. Are you at liberty to divulge the donor who's supporting your position?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. It's the Lyle Hallman Foundation. And it's not even just my role. They're a significant supporter of Capacity Canada. And the Hallman Foundation is supporting a variety of efforts at Capacity Canada right now that allows them to do kind of a sliding scale model for organizations that need the help.
Right. Radio Waterloo is one such non-profit organization that can benefit from the advice of Capacity Canada, and you've been in to speak to our board.
Yeah.
Radio Waterloo's been around for almost 50 years. This will be our 49th anniversary in October, so next year is the big 5-0 for Radio Waterloo. Radio Waterloo's been around longer, is older than most of the members that are serving on the board right now. And so there's some perception that we know what's going on, we know how to do this stuff. But that's not always the case. How do you approach boards, or how do boards get to know about Capacity Canada and that you're offering advice that might be useful to them?
Yeah, it's another really, really good question. Of course, there's a website, and there's word of mouth in the community. I'm finding one of the best places to start is on the Capacity Canada website. There's a scorecard that a nonprofit leader or board director can complete that kind of helps you do a self-assessment on your organization. And so, Bob, in the case of Radio Waterloo, a board member of Radio Waterloo could complete that scorecard. And after completing that scorecard, a member of the Capacity Canada team will then reach out to have a conversation with you about some of your responses, maybe the areas you might have self-identified are areas of growth or that we're looking to do more in, to then start to match together the different ways that the Capacity Canada team might be able to help, whether it's helping put together a strategic plan or facilitating sessions with members to hear from them about how they want to see the organization do more, or connecting to somebody like me to help with some fundraising or some government relations. So that has been one of the best ways I've learned in my time at Capacity Canada over the past year, is using that scorecard to identify for yourself kind of where our needs are, and then get connected with a variety of Capacity Canada supports. The other option, of course, is a lot of this starts from a place of trust, of knowing folks in your network that you might want to learn from. And that's where these different executives and residents have their own networks that they bring to Capacity Canada. And so in my case, there's a number of organizations that I've kind of brought to Capacity Canada in terms of my wanting to support them with the work they're doing that might not have previously engaged, and that I want to make sure that they have access to support around raising money so they can do more towards their mission. And so that's where the kind of word of mouth comes in. And then there's also these bigger signature events, things like that boot camp that I mentioned earlier, where you got a couple hundred people in the room. And I have found in a few cases, just inviting somebody to an event like that, they might benefit from that. Then they might learn about other ways that Capacity Canada could help them out.
Okay. You deal with fundraising, you said, and government liaison. Do the other executives have different areas of specialty?
That's it. Yeah, there are others who are also focused on fundraising as well, while other EIRs have other backgrounds, including other elected leaders.
Right.
And so Colleen James is also an executive resident, and she's a regional councillor here in the region of Waterloo. But also, folks who have much more academic training than I do. An old prof of mine from Laurier, Hugh Munro, is an executive in residence. Former VP of Alumni Relations at Wilfrid Laurier as well, Rob Donaldson, is an EIR. Good friend Scott Williams, who had been the executive director at Spectrum, is now also an executive in residence. So I think one of the strengths, if Kathy were here, the executive director, she would likely talk about just the diversity of skills and experiences of some of these folks. And as the name implies, my focus is here on Waterloo Region, in part because of the interest of the Hallman Foundation as a funder, and truthfully my own interest.
Yeah.
I want to be deepening my engagement with folks here in our community. But Capacity Canada, of course, has a national mandate. Started off as Capacity Waterloo Region, but now are national. And so some of the EIRs also are in different parts of the country. Okay.
So this is something that originated here at Waterloo Region?
That's right.
Oh.
Yeah. Capacity Waterloo Region. I should have mentioned that earlier if I was more fulsome. But I imagine it was just a few years before. My guess would be like around 2005, 2006 that the organization was started. And it was started by a number of leaders here in our community who identified that nonprofits needed access to these supports. That if we're going to have a bigger impact, we need to make sure that organizations have access to support to govern well and for their executive directors in their leadership. Started here. But as I said, in the years since, that mandate has expanded across the country and now have programs as far north as the Yukon, as far east as Newfoundland and Labrador, and so it's been a fun team to be a part of.
Yeah. With that great demand across the entire country, does that cast a light on nonprofits that everything is broken?
Well, I think what it does for me is, first of all, recognize how large the sector is and how much is being done with such little support. So maybe I'd put it the other way, Bob. I'd say, wow, how is it that so many nonprofit leaders are doing so much with so little? The numbers, I don't have them on me right now, but if you include healthcare in the definition, because healthcare is nonprofit, the nonprofit sector is like around 11% of GDP. Something staggering. You'd be very surprised by.
So just to put that into perspective, GDP is something like $40 trillion a year?
Well, yeah, and we hear about industries like the oil and gas industry and how important certain industries are to our economy, and certainly they are, but I believe the oil and gas industry is in the realm of 2 to 3% of GDP.
Is that all?
That's then you can then make a larger case if you talk about all the supply chain and various suppliers and customers of the core industry.
And
but
over 10% is
over 10 is the
generated by
nonprofit
nonprofits.
sector. again, if you include universities are nonprofit, hospitals are nonprofit,
For now.
and so is Radio Waterloo.
Yes.
Right? And so all those organizations collectively are all those that would stand to benefit from Capacity Canada's support. Of course, Capacity Canada isn't the only organization in the country that's supporting nonprofits in their governance. But I would be of the view that we should actually have more support for nonprofits and charities, given how much we rely on them to deliver core services to Canadians with increasingly insufficient budgets.
Yeah. I know that for a lot of the nonprofit organizations that I've been involved with, the funding has decreased. People aren't providing the grants. The bursaries are all gone.
That's right.
Governments, which were a large portion of funding sources, even if these are non-government organizations, have cut back on a lot of this, I guess, discretionary spending on nonprofit organizations.
Yeah, and I'm careful with that too, because if you include healthcare, I don't see it as particularly discretionary, but some would see it that way, or some would see what is the core role of government. I'm somebody who sees the core role of government to make people's lives better, and that includes the social safety net, and that would include everything from ensuring we follow through on housing being a human right, to ensuring we address the climate crisis, to making sure that people of all genders feel safe in our community. But so much of that, this past year, Bob, you saw there was talk of women and gender equality, a department of the federal government, being cut up to 85%. And that has real implications on the grants that organizations like the Sexual Assault Support Center of Waterloo Region and Women's Crisis Services and so many others would rely on. You're absolutely right. That's not to mention all of the cuts we've seen provincially. That it just is staggering to me what the provincial government. It seems like the only thing the provincial government can't get away with is buying a personal private jet for the premier. But short of that, look at the cuts to OSAP as another recent example, right? Yeah. And so, yes, in light of all that, it does make the jobs of nonprofit leaders all the more difficult when they're delivering services that are so, in my view, kind of core to our well-being as Canadians and as folks here in Waterloo Region.
Yeah. Not wanting to obsess on money, but fundraising and available funds is probably the biggest obstacle to having an effective nonprofit organization. Every organization has always been struggling for funds. So what advice do you have for an organization that isn't quite making ends meet but still doing valuable work?
Yeah, it's a good question, Bob. In my view, when I've been talking about fundraising with organizations in our community, what we usually start with is coming back to the core work that they do that is exciting to the people they are serving, that emotional hook. So we'll use Radio Waterloo as an example. If we're talking about the work of Radio Waterloo, to me as a starting point, if we're talking about raising money, we start with what is it that is so integral to the work you and others do as volunteers here. And I think about in democratic decline, the importance of independent journalism. This conversation right here, and the way I've been here before, keeping elected leaders accountable and opening up the lines of communication. If you want to stop fascism and authoritarianism, you do it by opening up communication in a community, right? Yeah. With community-based leaders and journalists who understand the context to ask the right questions. So all of that, to me, is where you start to remind the core folks involved, the board or the staff, the emotional importance of what you're doing. With that established, then it's usually an exercise in reflecting on who are our strongest supporters. So if you're going to think about raising funds, before you go knocking on doors of people you've never met before, you're likely going to want to re-engage with, your past donors, for example, with your existing or past board members, and be getting some input from them on what they're excited by and where they want to see the organization going.
So communication.
Well, yeah, and listening, of course. This is where I think there's a lot of connections between the work of an elected leader and a nonprofit leader, in that empathy is so important.
Yes.
In my time at Sustainable Waterloo Region, when we grew the organization and the impact we're having, I think a big part of it is that we were listening to the needs of the community as we expanded our supports from helping businesses reduce their emissions to helping the region put together a climate action plan to helping with active transportation. And in democracy, it's similar. You're listening to people and trying to address their needs. And I think around fundraising, it's, again, the same kind of exercise. Of course, with that, though, you need to then put together opportunities for folks to donate. So whether that's a monthly donor program, or maybe it's some signature events in the community, there's a variety of options available. But that's usually the pathway if we're thinking about raising funds, is starting with, what is the organization doing that is so a point of passion for the people who are core to it, identifying your biggest supporters, and then bringing something to them that they could be a part of with you. And over time, of course, you can then broaden your net beyond that core group, potentially all the way out to knocking on doors.
Yeah, yeah. With Radio Waterloo and just nonprofits in general, I think that's a disconnect, because the people who are passionate about doing the work for the nonprofit, in our case, the radio broadcasting and communicating to the public, Sexual Assault Support Center providing support for women who have had assault experiences. I don't know, the people who do that kind of work tend to not be focused on the finances so much. So it's a foreign skill set to the people who are really engaged with that nonprofit organization.
Well, I'd put forward to you, Bob, in part as a result of all the cuts we were speaking about earlier, that increasingly the nonprofit leaders I know in our community have been forced to really develop that muscle. Okay. And you mentioned, you referred back to the Sexual Assault Support Center as one example in our community, and they have withstood cut after cut over the years. And I am really impressed by their leadership team and how they've put together everything from a monthly donor program to their annual gala, and of course the grants that they have also written and received, and government funding they've been successful with. In my time as an MP, I did also work with them to get them in front of some key decision makers federally. But as a result of all that, they've been able to cut the wait times for survivors. And of course, their goal is that survivors shouldn't have to wait at all to get access to support from SASC. And, back to that conversation about, are these core services? Well, government has kind of dropped the ball. And it's organizations like the Sexual Assault Support Center who are picking up the pieces, who are strengthening their fundraising capabilities, and as a result are reducing that wait list for survivors. And for folks listening, if you want to support SASC, they do accept monthly donors. You can be a part of helping reduce the wait list for survivors. And I'd encourage folks to check them out as one of many worthy organizations in our community that we need to be thinking about. What kind of community do we want to have? And if we want to have a community that, for example, survivors don't have to wait for care, then we need to be supporting organizations like SASC, including as monthly donors.
Okay. And knowing about these financial options, about these donation techniques, is something that can be taught. I mean, I come into Radio Waterloo as a techie. I can run an audio board. I can fix a microphone, but I have no financial skills to write home about. You can teach me?
Well, but this is actually, again, core to what excites me about Capacity Canada, is that if you have organizations like Capacity Canada doing well in our community, then you're actually allowing those who have a passion for their work, the way you just described, to stay focused on the thing they're most passionate about.
Right.
We'll be at our best if those like yourself, Bob, get to focus on the content and preparing for this conversation with the kind of questions that are going to lead towards an enlightening conversation for the community, not having you having to be in this conversation in the back of your mind thinking about how you're going to keep the lights on tomorrow.
Right.
And that is possible if the CKMS and Radio Waterloo board is governing in such a way that they're thinking about the long-term fundraising and able to communicate back to content providers like yourself to make sure that that support is there, and maybe even that technology is improved over time so that you have access to all the best gear to be maybe out in the community.
Right.
As I've seen you, I remember I saw you at the Irish Real Life Festival, for example.
Yep.
And there's, some content that can be produced here on site, but there's a lot that's out in the community that you can only get if you're there on site the day of the opening of a new housing development or whatever else might be the case.
Yeah. One of the sad things that we've recently lost the funding for our news program, for example. I hear there's maybe some good news on the horizon, that the funding may be restored. And that's exactly the kind of thing that a CKMS news team would do, is go out into the community, be at those housing development openings, at the Real Life Festival, at all the events that take place throughout the year.
Well, and back to how important fundraising is, how important for our community is it to have independent journalists at those kinds of announcements, so that when folks in our community learn about that housing announcement, that somebody there is asking the question about maybe why is it that we haven't built housing co-ops in our community the way we used to prior to 1995. And that journalist with CKMS is not beholden to any pension fund or any other corporate owner, but is actually there with the vested interest of our community. That, to me, is what excites me about donating to CKMS, as an example, is that we need local journalists who are accountable to our community first and foremost. And so that's part of the fun I'm having in this role, is working with organizations with that lens, so that you as an example, know far more about radio than I do. But if I can help CKMS to grow their ability to engage with our community through raising funds, well, what a joy.
Is one of the strategies to achieve that perhaps diversification of the board? The board of Radio Waterloo, for example, is made up of techies and journalists and content creators. But would it help a board to actually have somebody who understands fundraising and financial issues and recruit them to be on the board?
Yeah, this is again where there are others who have more governance experience than I do. But I can say, Bob, certainly when you look at a board, some ways to look at it are the diversity of skills. So a lot of the time people will think, I got to make sure I have an accountant on my board because I need that skill, or I need a lawyer on my board. And certainly, not to say it's not helpful to have those professions represented on the board. Another skill to consider definitely would be somebody with some fundraising experience. But I think another really important way to think about diversity on a board is diversity of the folks you're looking to engage with. Because should you have that kind of diversity of representation on your board, you're going to understand your community you're looking to serve that much better. And you'll be better in your work. And there's a direct line between the impact an organization has and the interest a donor might have in contributing to that cause.
Right.
And so definitely not only having somebody with fundraising experience, but I would encourage a nonprofit thinking about raising funds to look at the board and ensure that that board is reflective in racial background, cultural background, social economic background. Identities on that board should ideally reflect the people you're serving. And in the case of CKMS, it's a pretty wide community you're serving.
Yeah.
So it means that there's some work to do there to ensure that the stories of those you're looking to cover are maybe reflective to some extent on the representatives you have. Ultimately, what a board is, right. It's the community's voice for accountability in that organization. The more diverse the community's voice, the better.
You said something earlier about operational boards, functional boards, where the board members themselves take an active role in delivering the services for the nonprofit.
Yeah.
Is that a good model, or is it a better model to have strictly a board that does governance at a distance from the actual delivery of service?
Yeah, my view, Bob, is that one isn't better or worse than the other. It's about the stage of the organization's development and what does that organization need right now. So I'll give you an example. If you're starting an organization from scratch, just getting off the ground, have no, few volunteers, let alone staff, at that stage of organization, somebody who's joining that board has to recognize this is going to be a working board.
Right.
That's not good or bad. That's just addressing the needs of the organization. And so, of course, every board has to ensure that the organization is following their legal and financial obligations. But the organization I just described, hypothetically, is going to be a board where those people are digging in and making connections for fundraising, maybe putting together the booth at the multicultural festival if they're going to show up. That's what I mean by our working board. These are people who are essentially volunteers for the organization and also serving to govern the board. Now, if that were the approach to the board for a $5 million organization, there'd be some good questions to be asked about why the same person who's governing is setting up the booth at the festival when you have a budget to pay staff to do that, and you can then better focus your board on the 5-year strategic plan or fundraising plan, or maybe you're looking to buy a building, who knows what else, right? So I think it's more about tailoring the focus of your board to the stage of the organization while never losing sight that every board has a fiduciary and legal obligation to the organization and that they need to make sure they're kind of hitting that as a minimum bar in addition to whatever else that might be the stage of the organization.
Is there a threshold at which an organization should move to a governance board rather than a working board?
One way of looking at it is around the staff team. Is if the organization is grassroots, doesn't have existing staff, you might expect then that the board might be more of a working board. In my experience, there's not like an income threshold or anything like that. Okay. I think it's more of an assessment of where that organization is at, but also might be, Bob, or you might want to talk to one of the governance experts at Capacity Canada. Right. And, I learned a lot from someone in our community named John Dinner. He was one of the folks at that boot camp I went to many years ago. Mm-hmm. And folks like John and others are some of the real governance pros in our community. And people like me have just learned from him over the years. And, I started and led 2 different nonprofits and reported to both those boards and have served on boards myself over the years, and have learned from some of those experiences. But there are other experts in this community.
Right. Boot camp, you said in November?
Yeah, that's right. So November 2026 will be the next one. For anyone listening who might be interested for your organization, you can sign up. Capacity Canada has an email list to hear about their boot camp as speakers get announced and these kinds of things. But also there's an opportunity, if organizations are in financial need and want access, there are potentials for bursaries and these kinds of things as we get closer as well. And so I think the best thing for anybody interested is just to sign up for Capacity Canada's email list. You'll then hear, weekly about some of the offerings that they have, including boot camp, and have a sense of whether that might be something that might be a benefit to you.
Right. Looks like on the website there's events listed throughout the year.
That's right.
Webinars, seminars, workshops. So this is by invitation only? Do you have to be engaged by an executive in residence in order to participate?
Oh, just the other way around, actually. It's open to everyone. That's actually the benefit that Capacity Canada, because they have support from folks like the Hallman Foundation, that there is such an open door. And so it's more around getting a sense of the offerings, and if an upcoming webinar is of interest, it's just about somebody signing up. And so that's why I say head over to capacitycanada.ca. You can sign up for the email list from there, And if a listener has a particular interest, you'll find a webinar that might be of interest to you. And I think you'll often find kind of a sliding scale model to make sure that that finances aren't a reason to not get access to support.
Right. On a personal note, you have a new youngster in the world.
That's right.
I met him a few months ago at the
That's
Irish
right.
Real Life Festival.
That's right.
How's life as a dad?
I appreciate you asking, Bob. I was hoping we might get to it over the course of the conversation. It's been wonderful. I feel very grateful. I'm 41, and so at this stage of life, as a new parent, it's just a real blessing.
Yeah.
I bet, you know what, any stage of life that's likely the case. It feels that way for me right now, for sure.
Yeah.
And also, I guess, I had hoped to continue as our MP after the election that was around 1 year ago at this time. And it's interesting how life doesn't always go, and people of faith have a particular emphasis on this, might not go always the way you want it to, but maybe there are certain, something else at play that helps guide the way it should. And in this case, I feel a bit of a blessing in disguise to have time at home.
Right.
And not be traveling as much as I was. This role with Capacity Canada is hyper local. So I have some travel. I'm also the deputy leader of the Green Party right now.
Yeah.
And so I'll be in Ottawa next week for the pre-budget announcements with the federal government.
Okay.
So I have some travel, but it's just nothing at this, like the scale of when I had been serving as our MP.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, it's I loved it. And most weekdays I'd be leaving on a Sunday afternoon and not back home until Thursday night or Friday morning.
Right.
And then, of course, at events across the community over the weekend. And so to have time at home and time with Lyndon, our young one, has just really been really, really special.
Yeah. Take advantage of it. That time is precious. It goes by so awfully quickly.
Well, there's that cliche that I feel is so true. The days are long and the years are short.
Yes.
I can tell you at 3 a.m. last night, it certainly felt long. She was up and it seemed like she was having a party at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
And then even just as a young parent, it's only been 9 months, but it does feel like it's gone fast in a way. And when you count it by month, it does kind of go pretty quick, right?
Yeah.
But it's such a blessing. And so thanks for that reminder, Bob.
Don't do what I did. I spent the years of my child's youth commuting back and forth to work in Toronto, so take advantage of the opportunity while you can.
Well, and what a privilege too, right? I think it's important to recognize our privilege, and I do feel so privileged that I get to do work right now that allows me to be mostly at home. And, I'm still knocking on doors in our community, and I have found
Good.
bringing Lyndon with me, some folks even have a better reaction. Maybe they're more open to chatting, and I've really enjoyed it too. And so it's nice where you can find where family and our vocations or passions or work can kind of blend together. She's done 2 canvases so far. She fell asleep at both.
No reflection on the topics being discussed.
Oh, wow, hard to say. But I certainly have had some better responses at doors when she's been there with me.
Right. You have things to do, places to be, children to take care of.
Well,
So,
thanks for having me on, Bob. I really enjoyed the conversation. These kind of far-ranging, open-ended, these are a lot of fun. And so thanks for what you do here at Radio Waterloo, and thanks for having me back on again.
I fully intend to have you back again at some point to talk about possibly something else, or maybe the same thing all over again.
Either one works for me.
All right. Mike Morrice, thanks for telling us about Capacity Canada. Thanks for telling us about the personal life of Mike Morrice. That's always nice to hear, too.
Great to be with you again.
Yeah. You're listening to CKMS Community Connections. My name is Bob Jonkman. Going to be listening to a little bit of music by David James Allen. That's David James Allen, The Devil in Me, an instrumental track. David James Allen is local to Kitchener. I've got to see if I can get him into the studio at some point. Mike Morrice has left us, but in his place we have Marinus de Groot. Welcome to CKMS Community Connections.
Glad to be here. And that was a really wonderful conversation, encouraging.
Yes, always nice to have a positive.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You're the Radio Waterloo News Committee Coordinator.
That's right.
And been out of a job recently since we've lost funding in January.
Yeah.
So what do you see on the future for CKMS News?
I hope that we can build it. I mean, we were down to almost nothing, and I think I would really like to think about something we can do as a stopgap if the new funding doesn't come in right away, and think of ways that are manageable, that within our reach, that how we can serve our community. And I'm particularly thinking about the municipal election coming up, and even some of the things that Mike was talking about. I think we could actually make a contribution, even though we're so limited in terms of our resources, etc.
Right. More funding would certainly help.
Of course.
But I think the biggest problem that we have is that we don't have enough volunteers at the radio station to do all the work that needs to be done. Get some people who have an interest in journalism out there with a microphone and contribute back to Radio Waterloo. That's a good start.
And I think there are people out there, I think they just don't realize, first of all, that they can make a contribution this way, but also how much of a joy it can be to be involved in this kind of work. I mean, I do my radio program, which is, I started with CKWR and then Midtown Radio, and now also with CKMS. And it's just such a joy doing this. I would love to bring people on board and say, hey, we can form a team, and I can guarantee it's going to be a joyous time.
Right. Yeah. Doing stuff as a group with a single focus, with a joint focus is always exciting.
Yes, and that's what I'd really like to see.
So what sort of things do you want to explore for the municipal election coming up in October?
Well, people are already starting to get ready, and I'm particularly interested in these civil society organizations that put on the all candidates meetings and send out questionnaires and, put at forums and sometimes make recommendations and endorsements. I think it's such an important part of the whole process, and ones that don't get a lot of coverage in themselves, because there's one thing is covering the candidates and their messages and all of that, but I think also that deserves coverage. And then the other thing we don't get very much at the local level is just simply commentary, not necessarily opinion, but commentary, reflection. Okay. There's so much of that on the global and national and international scene. There's almost none of that on the local and regional level. And I think that's something actually we should be able to provide if we can find people who can offer that kind of reflection. It doesn't have to be all of one political stripe, but it should at least be thoughtful.
Right.
Because I think if we learn to think of elections rather than as contests, as basically deliberation periods, we're asked to make a decision, and it really is a communication process, talking back and forth between the candidates, between the public, and amongst ourselves to think what kind of future we want here. What do we want our public servants to be like? What kind of future do we have for our cities and our townships and our region?
Right. I can tell you we have lots of room on the CKMS radio schedule. So if we dig out some journalists who want to do this kind of thing, we can accommodate you.
Yes, and there's room for, at any level. You can just simply help with the recording, you can help with the editing, you can come up with story ideas, you can come up with the scheduling.
Yep.
There's room for all kinds of participation, much like you have in a theater group, for instance. And people put on these wonderful performances, but there's also people working the boards and doing front of house and doing lighting and we have all
Connect
those
with
kinds
us
of engagements.
at office at radiowaterloo.ca. Go to the website radiowaterloo.ca to get more information. You've been listening to CKMS Community Connections on CKMS FM. My name is Bob Jonkman. CKMS Community Connections is sponsored by Radio Waterloo. Executive producer is Jennifer Strong. We air every Monday at 3 p.m., alternate Fridays at 3 p.m., finishing a little bit early because this is the 20th of April, 420, and we have a little bit of celebration to do. Here's Kevin Westphal with the celebration song.
Puff, puff, pass in a tokey, giggle, happy, fun tobacco, feel wacky, make you happy, have a snacky, giggle, giggle, smoke, puffy, tokey, take a big rip and pass it on. The world's much better when we all get together, when we're loving one another, having fun. So let's have a hoot, a puffy, toot, and all sing the marijuana song. Get the rolling papers, all get the weed. Let's roll the biggest reefer that the world has ever seen. We can make Pop-Tarts and grilled cheese. Everybody, let's have fun. Work, not enough play. Hell, tomorrow may never come. So let's have a hoot, a puffy, toot, and all sing the marijuana song. Puff, pass in a tokey, giggle, happy, fun tobacco, feel wacky, make you happy, have a snacky, giggle, smoke, puffy, tokey, take a big rip and pass it on. Well, the world's much better when we all get together, when we're loving one another, having fun. So let's have a hoot, a puffy, toot, and all sing the marijuana song. Sick and tired of the 6 o'clock news. I'm done with politicians and political views. You know the world's much better when we all get along. Maybe in the next verse, we could fire up the bong. Puff, pass in a tokey, giggle, happy, fun tobacco, feel wacky, make you happy, have a snacky, giggle, smoke, puffy, tokey, take a big rip and pass it on. Well, the world's much better when we all get together, when we're loving one another, having fun. So let's have a hoot, a puffy, toot, and all sing the marijuana song. So let's have a hoot, a puffy, toot, fun tobacco, feel wacky, have a snacky, make you happy, let's sing the marijuana song.